I'm Dr. Duke with the New American, and I'm joined today by Dr. Wayne Sedlak of Reformation Hope Church in Wisconsin. Dr. Sedlak, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me on, Duke.
Give us a little bit about your background. Tell us about your church and what it is that you do.
Well, I've been 45 years in the ministry, both a pastor and as a missionary in 2 continents. And I'm still a missionary in a very real sense. I train several times a week. I train indigenous people in Africa. But I've been a pastor all those years as well. Reformation Hope Church is the church in Brookfield. So for 45 years, I've enjoyed myself. You know, they say if you enjoy what you're doing, you never work a day in your life. And I love what I'm doing. But we find the same problems here in America, accentuated, and what we can expect in America is exactly what's happening up there in northeastern Africa. We might want to touch on that.
It's amazing how history repeats itself. How can people who want to find out more of your work and your ministry, how can they reach you?
Well, they can go to visionviewpoint.com. At Vision Viewpoint, there's resources there. They can, there's opportunities to gain resources for the battle at hand. Visionviewpoint.com is where they can go.
Outstanding. Now, you have come up with a way that pastors can be more involved in what's going on in the country. It seems like far too often, particularly during the coronavirus, it seems as if the church and our pastors have been way too compliant. They're not willing to insert themselves. Talk about what you mean by interposition and how it works.
Let me back up just a moment so we get a little context. Back in the late 1970s, I was doing a lot of research, had access to a library that had colonial sermons on microfiche. You remember the old microfiche days? Yeah. Well, the sermons that carried down, and there were hundreds of them, from the colonial era, that means the colonial, and then into the early part of our republic, down to about 1820, I read many of those sermons. From there, I wrote the position paper, The Black Regiment, and how pastors were very much involved. Later, of course, Americans came to know from other articles as the Black Robe Regiment, and both names fit. The Black Regiment was the pulpits of the day that called our forefathers to what is called interposition of the lesser magistrate. Let me explain. Interposition is that term, that biblical doctrine that says that when there is oppression, injustice, someone stands in the gap to defend those who are oppressed. Now, I realize, unfortunately, the left has a monopoly on the word oppression. But we need to expose the socialism that creates the oppression and come from our position and expose it. Interposition means this. Our magistrates are sworn by oath to uphold, maintain, and defend the Constitution at every level of our society. So when a superior magistrate, so-called, say a governor or a president or a congressman or a court, stands against that oath, takes a stand, and it implements unconstitutional measures, it is the duty of those magistrates underneath that magistrate to stand against that criminal act. Violation of the oath is sacred, or rather is a breach of sacred trust. The Black Regiment called our forefathers, Tom Jefferson referenced it, the Reverend John Witherspoon, as you recognize, Duke, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. As a clergyman, he can be called, quite rightfully, the founding mentor. He taught many of those men. That great Scottish Presbyterian pastor who came to America taught the doctrine of interposition right out of the scriptures, and the likes of George Washington, Patrick Henry, and others consulted him many times during the course, prior to and during the course of the war. Again, interposition of the lesser magistrate is a function of the broader set of redemption. Now, Christ, I would say as a minister that Christ came to redeem us from our sins, but let's add to it, to defend us against the oppressiveness of one called the devil. And he has many of his henchmen. And those oppressors, and I would say to a man, socialism all throughout history, is created by those who either, and I don't really care about their motives, I only care about the results. They're oppressive. Socialism ends up becoming oppressive. And at some point, people have to take a stand against that kind of oppression. We're seeing that right now in Africa. I believe our people here, Duke, are going to see it very soon, and it's going to be more than just uncomfortable.
Well, it almost seems like it's here already, right? We look at the states, particularly places like California, that continue to open up all sorts of aspects of societal interaction again, with the exception of churches. We see that the churches across the country, when they're allowed to be open, are actually being given much harsher restrictions than people
That's
going
right.
to a lot of other places. How do you account for that? I mean, I think the answer is probably pretty obvious. How do you account for that? And what would be your advice to pastors on how they combat it?
Well, you and I both know that the pastors of the modern era have been reluctant to take a stand publicly. There's various reasons for that. Let's move past it for a moment and call them to their oath-bound, or that should be their oath-bound responsibilities. They have a responsibility to uphold the holy laws of God. They have the responsibility to uphold the righteousness of Jesus Christ. And that means a love for their neighbor. In this case, love is not just an emotion, but rather it's an act of fortitude and courage. Patrick Henry, George Washington, Witherspoon, and most of the signers of the Declaration were Christian men. So they understood it from their churches. They heard it preached in their churches, and they heard it preached that the likes of King George and Parliament were, in fact, oppressors. Well, we need to make it clear that what's happening in our country today is oppressive. It is an act of oppression, and I think the California churches that want to open are facing that directly now. We faced it in Wisconsin, and we prevailed thus far. However, it's going to come back at us in a very, very vicious manner, I believe, by the governor of this state. He's just as rabid as others. He seems to want to target the churches as well. Certainly in California, they're facing that, and I believe they got an uphill fight. And it may be involved in outright persecution. So they're going to learn the doctrine of the need for interposition very quickly. Even the policeman in the street is an officer who may not violate his oath of office. So if his superior tells him that he has to arrest somebody that otherwise is doing a lawful deed, constitutionally a lawful thing, he may not obey it. He cannot. You don't get a badge and a gun and a uniform under an oath that swears you to the Constitution, turn around and change your mind because someone told you from above that you can do that. Lieutenant Kelly did that in Vietnam. He murdered 22 unarmed Vietnamese and claimed his superiors ordered him so. Not good enough. He was court-martialed. Same in our system. Every civil magistrate is duty-bound to resist the encroachments of the higher magistrate. That's an historic doctrine for the churches, and it's about time that the modern churches learn their history and their heritage.
Absolutely. And on the way over to this interview, I don't remember exactly what state it was, but there was a state where there was a pastor holding services. If the doors closed, he had the congregation there, and the mayor of that town sent police officers to bang on the doors of the church while the service was going on, just to stand there and pound on the door to actually disrupt the service because they were unhappy that it was being held. Yeah, so this kind of thing is happening all over the place. I think at the Roman Catholic Church, if I'm not mistaken, what you just named was the policy of subsidiary, yeah. Right? Right. The idea that if somebody above you in the hierarchy is abusing their power, you have a moral obligation to resist them. Tell me how you'd like to see how is it happening in Wisconsin? Is it actually, are you seeing examples of this? And how can we spread it across the country?
There was just a few of us as pastors that kept our churches open the whole time. And I made it known there was a question of jurisdictional liability at their end. If they come to our church, they're going to be confronted with the fact that they have violated their oath and had no jurisdiction. It was actually voluntary. And people didn't know that. They treat it like it's policy. But it's actually jurisdiction. They're way out of their jurisdiction. So the point is, the American people have to be taught, I believe, an understanding of what their constitutional liberties are based upon, the foundations of that. And it goes back to a heritage of the Black Regiment. The pastors that mounted the pulpit way back when called our forefathers to honor, and they did. They took up a stand after many petitions. In fact, the Declaration of Independence was the direct fruit of interposition of the lesser magistrate. Remember, every civil magistrate gets his badge and his gun and his uniform or his office from an oath to uphold, maintain, and defend the Constitution. He can't change his mind later without inviting criminal sanctions, which should be registered against him. That's what I believe. And I believe the churches need to state that. Despite their desire to hide behind Romans 13:1, they don't read the whole context. Romans 13:1, 2, 3, and 4 gives you the context. The civil magistrate is there for the punishment of evildoers, criminals, and for praising and upholding the upright. So there's a context to Romans 13:1, and the previous verse to that chapter is overcoming evil. It says that. That's the verse just prior to that. So we have to understand there is a heritage here. It helped beget our constitutional heritage. It helped teach an earlier generation what interposition should be and gives us a constitutional right. And I would add the Second Amendment is very much a part of that interposition. In Africa right now, I'll share with you just a second. In Africa, they're suffering because they don't have the right. They don't have any version of the Second Amendment. They have no interposition. They have nothing. They're suffering terribly.
Pastor, give us your website so people can follow you.
Visionviewpoint.com. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us today.
God bless you.